Hi, Bob.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. I should say for our podcast listeners that I'm Bob Wright from Blogging Heads TV, and you are Bob Kagan. And I get, for one thing, from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but also you were a McCain foreign policy advisor, were you not, during the campaign?
Well, in a manner of speaking, yeah. I was listed as such, and I tried to be helpful when I could, which wasn't very often.
So I guess your chances of winding up in the government declined somewhat on the first Tuesday of November, then.
Well, I'm still hopeful. I have my lines in. I think there's still some possibilities of a big job dangling out there for me.
Well, I'll tell you, Obama shows no signs of being the kind of guy who holds a grudge.
He's post-partisan, man.
So if you want to start the rumor that you're the dark horse candidate for Secretary of State,
no,
this is the place.
That job's been filled, but there are other, there's other plums out there that I'm still hoping for.
Anything you want us to kind of set the stage for today?
Well, I think I probably better not talk about it because that crumbs the play. If you talk about the jobs that you're planning on getting, it messes things up, as you well know.
Supposedly, Rahm Emanuel is the one who leaked the word that he was going to be, that he was being offered the job. Didn't seem to hurt his prospects. Of course, he had already been offered the job. There is that difference.
That probably helps. I'm going to keep mum for now, okay, Bob?
Okay. Well, my lips are certainly sealed, but I favor you for whatever you aspire to.
Thank you.
So what do you think of this Hillary as Secretary of State prospect?
I quite like it, actually. It's a pleasant surprise from my point of view, partly because of who it isn't, because I was a little bit worried about some of the options out there, but partly because I actually think she might be a very good Secretary of State, very strong, but also, I would say, very principled. And I was a little bit worried that we were heading into this sort of realism light approach to the world, and I actually don't think that's what Hillary Clinton is.
Yeah, in fact, there's been some mumbling among people on the left that it's not clear what the difference is between her and John McCain on foreign policy. What would you say the big differences are?
I think there probably would be some differences of style and approach in some areas, but I think both of them are pretty... McCain's a lot more flexible than people thought, and the campaign rhetoric notwithstanding, I think that he would approach things pretty pragmatically, but with some deep core convictions. And, I think that, I guess I'd have to say that that's pretty much the way I characterize Hillary Clinton, too. I'm sure she's going to take a pragmatic approach, but the thing is, I really do think she believes in things, and that matters a lot.
What do you think she believes in?
Well, I think she believes in, God may I say it, help me, democracy. I think she believes that the United States has an important role in the world, maybe even that it's the indispensable nation. And so I think that actually leads you pretty far down the road on certain policy issues. Of course, not with, the fact that there's going to be some difficult choices to make and she'll have to be pragmatic. But I think she's got some basic core convictions.
Yeah, well, here's an interesting question, hypothetically. Suppose that in Afghanistan there were some of these so-called reconcilable Taliban, and a deal could be done. Now, that's not, I would say, first of all, that's not the kind of thing I tend to associate you with, so you might not be a big enthusiast in the first place. Maybe it would depend on the exact terms. Maybe I should ask you before continuing. What is your view on that?
No, look, I think that we have to be willing to talk to people and see whether they want to play ball. I have no problem with talking to anybody, especially if we're talking about the way Sunni radicals in Iraq decided to come over and stop being purely anti-American and destructive. I'm perfectly willing to talk to anybody who's along those lines. The only thing that would give me pause, and I'm sure would give you pause too, is if you're having conversations with people who have not actually made any fundamental strategic shift in their approach, and you're just doing it as a way of making it look like you're calming the situation down, which could lead to short-term advantages, but might not be beneficial in the long term.
Yeah, there's one other thing that could give some people pause, and actually Anne-Marie Slaughter brought this up on Blogging Heads, which is that the feminists in Obama's constituency might be opposed to doing business with the Taliban because of the way they treat women. And I was wondering where Hillary Clinton would stand on that, and whether she would have problems with doing business with the Taliban for the same reason. Is that the kind of case where you would favor following your ideals over pragmatism?
I think that, look, Obama made one minor, it was a minor campaign mistake, but it's something he has to deal with now. He tremendously oversold what he was going to do in Afghanistan, and he's got to begin to wind that back. He's got to find some way to start making some progress that does not, include sending in 100,000 American troops, which is not going to happen, and he doesn't have the troops to do it, and he doesn't want to do it. I think they're going to explore a lot of options, and I think that if Petraeus and if it's going to be Gates or whoever's the Secretary of Defense says, look, we ought to give this a shot, I think that she's not going to stand in the way of that, and that'll be one area where pragmatism is going to have to rule. But the real question will be, is it in fact pragmatically wise? And that's a question that I think that we don't know the answer to yet.
Mm-hmm. And you said there were some people you were actively worried about as Secretary of State. Do you want to name any names?
No,
there?
but I think that she's the only senator I would be happy about of the available senators they were talking about.
Mm-hmm. And okay, I can think of one person that rules out. The one who would favor a global test. So on this issue of realism, there was said to be. I don't know if split is the right word within the McCain campaign. It was said that he was subject to conflicting advice, that there was a camp, it was characterized as being neocons versus realists. I don't know if you still call yourself a neocon or what label you use, if any, but to these people, you would have been lumped with that group. Was it the case that there was any kind of struggle for his soul?
No. It was a total creation of people who were sort of, didn't feel part of, that they were, put it this way, they didn't feel they were where they should be, which was running the show. They were upset that somebody else was in there. There were no big debates, and frankly, on the issues that I worked on, the speeches that I worked on, the so-called realists and the so-called neocons saw eye to eye. And so I don't really think that this is mostly a fabrication. I don't think we would know that there was a split unless Elizabeth Buemiller hadn't, decided to write about it 55 times. So that's really not that much. And what I find extraordinary was people didn't notice that there were also some splits in the Obama camp, which will now be interesting to watch it's no longer interesting what McCain's camp was like, but it'll be interesting to watch how the various splits in the Obama camp now play themselves out in a new administration.
And what are you sensing so far? First of all, Hillary, you think represents a movement away from the realism that you worried about, or realism light that you worried about?
Well, I think that, we were going to get into this, I suppose, at some point, the issue of Russia. Mm-hmm. There are, obviously, there's more than one camp in Obama land, as witness, the various series of statements that he put out in that famous week after the Georgia intervention. What's interesting is that a lot of people who are the sort of leading holdovers from the first Clinton administration tend to be very big on the whole Europe whole and free business, very in favor of NATO enlargement, very concerned about the fate of Georgia, and I would associate that more with Secretary Clinton, potentially Secretary Clinton, as opposed to a somewhat more, we have to figure out a way to work with the Russians first, and why are we letting these Georgians drag us into all this kind of trouble? Now, any policy they're going to conduct is going to have this wonderful bifurcation. Any policy that any administration is going to conduct will have this bifurcation between, on the one hand, we need to work with Russia, on the other hand, we don't like the way they're bullying around their neighbors. But I would say that a Clinton State Department is more likely to be sympathetic to some of these states that are sort of under the Russian shadow right now. Yeah,
possibly more than me, for example.
Undoubtedly.
Although I'm a very sympathetic person in many ways. Before we get into Russia per se, last I heard, James Steinberg was being talked about as National Security Advisor. Is that the last thing you've heard, or?
All I know is what I read in the papers. He's an obvious choice. I must say, I can't think of someone who's better suited to that job. And I know that, as far as I could tell, when Obama was running, he consulted with Jim a lot. And anybody who talks to Jim is going to feel very confident that he understands the world and would make a very good national security advisor.
But he would be on the same side as Hillary on these issues?
Well, I don't want to get into it too much. I would say, Jim, if I had to, we've known each other for a long time. I would say that he's probably, I would put him more on the pragmatic, I hate these terms, it's so ridiculous, but, I think he's going to try to figure out how to make these relationships work. That he talks a lot about how important international cooperation is, including with Russia and China, and I think that that's going to be his emphasis. But, it all gets down to, then you start getting down to the details, and people come at these things with maybe slightly philosophical disagreements, but they do have to come up with a common policy. So I just think these policies will evolve, and they'll wind up having elements of both of these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Now on Russia, you're right that I think you and I have probably differing views. I guess with me and Georgia, it's a lot of it has to do with our behavior with respect to Kosovo leading up to Georgia. In my mind, I'm kind of as critical of that as I am of how we handled or didn't handle Georgia. But I guess a question I have for you in that regard is: do you think we should work hard to establish, to foster respect for international law and nourish international norms that we would like to see apply universally? In other words, should we do things? Should we avoid setting precedents that we wouldn't want to see nations like Russia set, and should we set precedents that we would want to see nations like Russia follow? You know where I'm leading.
I know where you're leading,
right?
But I must say, it's a wonderfully abstract discussion, which doesn't really help you when you're dealing with particular cases. Obviously, and I don't know what the abstract rule would be, that you never recognize breakaway. You completely forget about Wilsonian self-determination. And it's very attractive, and you'd say, well, we would have, the European problem wouldn't have been as great if we hadn't had self-determination after World War I, etc. But in practice, it's actually very hard to live up to, and I don't think even you could live by a universal principle that we should never recognize the breaking up of states into component parts or the breakaway of various provinces. Do you think you could live with a universal principle like that?
Well, you'd probably be able to come up with a case where I'd have trouble, but for now the question is, was Kosovo such a case? And in case any viewers have not, seen where I'm leading with this, the issue here is, of course, we recognized Kosovo's independence unilaterally. Sometime before Russia recognized the breakaway provinces, I don't know how you pronounce Ossetia or Ossetia or whatever, but and at the time that we did, there were people, in fact, on Blogging Heads TV, Matthew Lee said, you realize if we unilaterally recognize Kosovo, Russia is going to want to unilaterally recognize the breakaway republic in Georgia, and you can't do these things, casually if you want to build up respect for international law. And so
well, wait a second. There's two questions. You could have stopped right there and said you shouldn't do this on the practical grounds that this is going to lead to Russia recognizing Abkhazia and Ossetia, and that you don't want that to happen, therefore you shouldn't do it. If you then add the next clause, because you want to uphold international law, I'm not sure. I don't think there is an international law that's going to answer this problem for you every time, so I wouldn't worry about that. Aren't you more concerned? Here's my question for you. Are you more concerned about the practical consequences of recognizing Kosovo, or are you more concerned about the international legal consequences?
I'm concerned about the practical consequences of us not having an agreed-upon mechanism for resolving issues like that. So when I talk about international law, I'm partly talking about the part of it that hasn't evolved yet and whose evolution we should be fostering.
Well, so let's dig into that a little bit. There was a pretty well-agreed mechanism for how to deal with Kosovo. The problem was there was one country that disagreed. There were others that were unhappy, like, Italy and Greece had no sympathy for the Kosovars, and there were others like that. But basically, Europe and the United States had worked out a fairly straightforward agreed mechanism. By the way, as you know, Bob,
But wait a second, Bob, you realize what you're saying is the U.S. and our allies had agreed on what should be done, so where's the disagreement? Well,
Bob,
of course we and our allies agree.
Calm down. I know where I'm going also, and where I'm going is, if you have one country, in this case Russia, that objects to moving down in this process, and by the way, I just want to make it clear, as you know, the process was painstaking. It isn't like people woke up one day and said, let's recognize Kosovo independence. There was endless negotiations. There were years of efforts to find some basic modus vivendi between the Serbs and the Kosovars that would make these things work. The Russians actually played, as I'm sure you know, a bit of a spoiler role in this, in supporting Serb resistance to these agreements. But from an international law perspective, if you have one country, in this case Russia, objecting to this effort to work out a mechanism that other countries have come up with, then what do you do then? And you face this. This isn't just the issue of Kosovo or self-determination. This is an issue across the board on international legal principles. What do you do when a majority of the larger countries or a majority of countries in the UN want to do something and one country doesn't want to do it? What is the international legal answer to that problem?
I seriously doubt that Russia was the only country in the whole world that was opposed to it.
They were not the only country in the whole world, but they were the ones that were principally opposed to it. If Russia, Bob, if Russia...
They were the nearby power, and they were very nearby and pretty damn powerful.
They're actually not that nearby. I don't know how Kosovo ever came to be bordering on Russia. I think it's probably well over 1,000 miles away.
They're closer to it than we are. They're closer to it than we are, and a hell of a lot closer to Georgia than we are.
Well, okay. Which argument do you want to have? Do you want to have the international law argument or the Russia's right to veto this argument?
Well, I think, well, again, you're putting it as Russia's right to veto, when in fact there were some countries that favored it, some that opposed it. You keep emphasizing the ones that are our allies and favored it, but it wasn't the whole world against one nation. And my main point is, I don't know exactly what the criterion should be, but I think before we go around saying, okay, this secessionist province is now a nation, we should ask ourselves, what are the long-term consequences? What are we positing as the criterion? Is the criterion whatever the U.S. and Europe wants? Well, that's not going to wash because, China and Russia would not be too favorably disposed to that. So what were we saying was the procedure that we would recognize if it were turned into a universal principle? Well, us and our friends, or what?
The effort was made to bring Russia in and to talk to Russia at great length, and ultimately Russia disagreed. Now, let's stop having bogeymen for a second. Let's just talk about these countries as if they're countries 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, okay?
Yeah.
How do you move forward on any kind of, you say, let's set up a set of criteria. How do you move forward and set up a set of criteria if you don't have international agreement on the criteria?
Well, then it's difficult, but if you believe, like me, that international law, we should be fostering the systematic evolution of coherent international law, all I'm saying is, before you do something like this, there's clearly going to be a precedent. Decide what you're going to say about what kind of precedent it sets, and be sure it's one you're willing to stick with. The Bush administration did not do this because they don't give a damn about international law.
Oh, that's ridiculous! Now you're just flying off the handle. Look.
Well, did they do it?
Well,
did they do it?
First of all, this wasn't just a they situation. I mean, this was in fact an extended multilateral dialogue and trialogue and discussion to try to work this out, which included the Russians and all kinds of other people. Now, there are a lot of people who would say, and I think I agree with this, if Russia, with regard to Ossetia and Abkhazia, had pursued the same kind of effort to achieve some kind of reasonable modus vivendi that everybody could live with, that Europe and the United States did on Kosovo, then maybe that is a precedent we would have been willing to live with. But that wasn't what Russia did. And so, But my bigger question for you is, let's talk about what you had this nice phrase tripping off your tongue, international coherent body of international law, etc. That sounds a lot easier to do than it is, as you know.
That's very hard. You got to be careful and not screw up.
And the question is, there are very few things that especially things that have to do with war and peace and perceptions of security and the typical competitions that occur among great powers, which you can codify into a law that everyone agrees with. Because, as you know, every nation has its own set of equities and its own set of interests, and those interests, and now I'll be the realist, get in the way of coming up with international legal principles that everyone wants to be bound by all the time. Now, if you ask me, am I willing to live with the precedent that was established by the effort in Kosovo? I am willing to live with that precedent. That precedent was an effort to negotiate a deal that everyone could live with. It was undertaken with great seriousness. No one was eager to have a bad outcome with regard to this. And so that is a reasonable precedent, unless you can come up with a rule, which I don't think you can live with, which says we will never, ever recognize these kinds of situations.
So the precedent you're willing to live with is that before we do something, we try to engage in discussions, and if there's not agreement, then the U.S. and its allies get their way, as I understand it.
Well,
that's the only universal, that's the only general extrapolation
what
I see from.
Do you have, Bob?
So you're agreeing that's what you're saying the international law should be?
Well, first of all, that is what international law is. I don't know whether you've noticed over the last 300 years, international law tends to be made by the most powerful nations.
So it should be the U.S. and its friends. That's what international law should be. It doesn't even have to be.
Leave the U.S. out. The Europeans made all kinds of decisions that they would have made by themselves with or without the United States with regard to Kosovo, including what to do before, about Kosovo. The Germans rushed in and recognized, Croatia during the breakup of Yugoslavia. This isn't just the United States. The question of how you build international law is not just... that's why I do turn the question back at you. If you are going to say that if one or two of the powers gets up and says, I don't like this, that there will be therefore no further movement in this situation or any other situation, what is your proposal for building up international legal principles?
All I'm asking is that
you don't want to answer my question, I guess.
What would I do? Well, I can imagine if you ask me to construct some mechanism.
Yeah, construct it.
Well, suppose the Security Council sanctions secession, I'd be fine with that. For example, now you wouldn't because Russia would have vetoed that.
Well, here's my next question for you. Are you willing to be bound by the Security Council in terms of what actions will and will not be taken in the world overall? Or is it just on this issue?
Not in every single issue,
Why not?
No.
Because then you've departed... The Security Council, which, by the way, is a very flawed idea of international law...
It is a very flawed structure, I agree, and it is not the way I would have it. On the other hand, one thing I'm interested in is reforming the United Nations, and in what direction, though?
I think you have to broaden the Security Council. I think you have to add more members, and I would be willing to give all of them the veto, by the way. I'm not...
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. That's moving it toward impotence. To give more nations the veto makes it even less significant than it is now.
Okay.
I would move in the other direction and create a supermajority that is something less than a single nation veto.
Okay, well then if you were to do that, then you could have the United States and Europe making decisions over the objection of Russia and China.
Sometimes you would, and sometimes we would lose, and that's the way, if you mean international law seriously as a term, that's the way it would work. We wouldn't always get our way.
Do you think China and Russia would agree to a majority rule on the Security Council?
I didn't say majority, I said supermajority. So, for example...
There's 5 permanent members. What's the supermajority?
Oh, well, it could be moving to you could say expand the permanent membership to 7 or 8.
And who would you add?
Look, Bob, I'm not sketch this out in detail.
I'm going somewhere because the point is...
I would add China for sure.
You would take China... You would what?
To the Security Council, the permanent membership. There's a lot of ways you could go.
No, but here's the problem. Okay, look, I get it, but here's the problem. The problem is, for instance, if you were going to add to the Security Council, you would certainly add Japan or India, right?
Well, actually, I'm not so sure I would add a nation. There we get into non-proliferation and respect for international law, whether you want to reward a nation for becoming a nuclear power outside of international law and so on.
Would you add Japan?
That would certainly be a leading candidate.
Okay,
yes.
So the Chinese would veto adding Japan, right?
Well, look, there are intrinsic problems with reforming, and maybe you want to start all over again.
It's called nations pursuing national interests. That's what it's called. That's the problem. You're trying to look for ways to skirt the basic problem.
I'm actually not sure that I don't know what the mechanism is for reforming the structure. I'm not sure that the Security Council unanimity among permanent members is a prerequisite.
For adding another permanent member, it certainly is.
Well, that is clearly a problem with reforming the UN. Is how do you get there? But
the problem of how to get there is the problem. It's not about the UN. It is the problem.
Yeah, but there's a separate matter that you and I have very different ideas of what the UN should be, and you think it should be less significant.
No, I think
it should have more influence.
I get that, but I don't know how you get to where you want to go. Even let's say I'm even in agreement with you.
Start all over. Abolish it and start a new club. I'm okay with that, but of course then you would want the club to only include democracies, and I wouldn't.
Bob, I'm not your problem. I'm not your problem.
No, because McCain lost.
No, I'm not your problem in a bigger sense than that. reforming the Security Council, redesigning the Security Council, is going to be opposed, okay? It is going to be opposed by China. It's going to be opposed by Russia. And for all you know, it's going to be opposed by France, too, okay? I'm not the problem. The problem is the international system. And you want to move forward, which I understand, but there are reasons, believe it or not, there are reasons why it's been difficult to move forward that have nothing to do with the last 8 years and George W. Bush. The UN Security Council, as you know, was not founded to be this wonderful... I mean, you know how come we wound up with the 5 members that we wound up with, and I agree with you, it should be scrapped and reformed. The problem is they don't want to scrap it and reform it. And therefore you're stuck, and you can be upset with me and claim that I'm the one who's standing in your way of reforming the world, but I'm not. You're facing a much more difficult problem, which is the interests of powerful nation-states that want to have their interests respected and are not willing to submit to a system that, from their point of view, would be worse off than holding a veto in a permanent Security Council of 5 veto-wielding members.
You know, I'm not convinced that you're right, actually. I am convinced that the UN's actual structure makes it very hard to reform the UN from within. I don't know that it's impossible. It's very hard. I'm not convinced that you couldn't design a club from the ground up that nations like China would find it in their interest to be in.
Well,
of course, it would mean that we had to actually agree to abide by its rulings, and of course one problem is that we have not, and in the case of the Iraq War, we did not.
Or in the case of the Kosovo War, right?
Well, right, we ignored it, we bypassed it.
Or in the case of 99.9% of the wars that the United States has ever fought, right?
Right.
In the case of the wars that the other countries have fought and would like to fight maybe in the future also, right? You know, so we're just a real long way from... from the situation that you would like to be able to create.
We're a very long way, and the question is, each step of the way, do you want to get closer or further away? In the case of the Iraq War, I think what Bush did and you favored got us further away. I think in the case of Kosovo, you got us further in the way.
Both Kosovos, including the 1999 war, which you also opposed, I take it?
At the time, I expressed ambivalence and pointed out.
Why weren't you upset about the violation of international law in that circumstance?
Well, because look, I'm not an absolutist. You can
You're not an absolutist?
No, I'm not an absolutist.
Then we're back to talking about individual cases.
Well, we're talking about individual cases.
Not establishing a body of law.
No, that's not true. You have to accept that until we get to coherent and widely respected international law, it will be a step-by-step process, and there will be there will be outliers.
Was the 1999 war against Kosovo a step forward or a step away from international legal principles?
Well, it didn't. It certainly didn't uphold them. No.
No, and you know perfectly well that the Russians were much more upset about that war in 1999 than they were about the recognition of Kosovo independence in the last year. I mean, that was a big turning point in Russian attitudes, and the reason was because just exactly the way you've been putting it, that the United States and its club of friends in Europe decided to do something, and it completely ignored Russia, including ignoring their right to veto in the UN Security Council. That really sent the Russians into a tailspin.
Right, and I'm not positive that was a good thing.
Well, I know, but I remember. I mean, at the time, when again all these consequences could have been foreseen, I'm guessing that you decided, as did a very large number of people in the United States and Europe, that the price of not acting was too great. And so this was one of those circumstances.
No, I actually didn't. I favored the Bosnia intervention long before Clinton decided to intervene, but I was not championing the Kosovo intervention at the time.
Okay, well, but you weren't raising a hue and cry about how this was affecting international law.
Actually, at the time, I wrote an op-ed pointing out in the abstract that about that time that if we were going to move systematically towards humanitarian intervention as a UN-sponsored thing, there would be costs. There were trade-offs in terms of what the UN was originally supposed to be fundamentally about, right, which was to prevent transborder aggression. I actually did make that point.
Well, I commend you. And that is the conundrum, obviously. And the whole notion of humanitarian intervention is at odds. It is at odds with international law. Now, there are people working very hard to try to square the circle and come up with this idea of responsibility to protect. And, Anne-Marie Slaughter and others have been trying to move in this direction to have a more interventionist law. But, guess who is in opposition to that more interventionist legal approach? It's Russia and China. And so it seems that it's going to be very difficult, and I would predict impossible, to make progress toward any kind of international principle of responsibility to protect, as long as Russia and China have the capacity to block it, because it's not in their interest. And that's a classic case of how do you move forward in the way that you would like to move forward in terms of building up international legal doctrines when you keep bumping up against the basic fact, which is opposition to that. And, let's not forget, international law is it's not value neutral, right? It tends, especially the kind of international legal principles that we all tend to support, they tend to support what we used to call a liberal international order, right? But not everybody in the international system favors our definition of a liberal international order. And so, there's no such thing as setting up an international legal mechanism that doesn't favor either one group of powers or one way of looking at the world, right?
I think I agree.
When they set up the Concert of Europe, which people always point to in the 19th century, the Concert of Europe was primarily about preserving monarchy and aristocracy against revolution from below. And as soon as that consensus broke down, the Concert of Europe also broke down. So these kinds of international systems always favor one approach or the other. It's not been possible yet in human history to have widely diverse types of governments and multiple great powers come up with an international set of international legal principles that they're all willing to abide by.
I'm not sure I'd buy into that exactly as you phrased it, but it's certainly the case that it is only recently that the state of technology has really compelled us to seriously confront issues of global governance. It's not surprising to me that in the 17th century, for example, or the 18th or 19th, there wasn't much of it. I mean, it's pretty clear that the direction of technological evolution has made the peoples around the world more and more interdependent, and just confronts us with fundamentally new issues. And in fact, maybe that's a transition to G20, which we were going to talk about. But go ahead and say anything else about this you want to say.
Well, I mean, I think, frankly, my own view of the global communication revolution is that it cuts in multiple directions. It doesn't cut all, I assume you would agree with this, it doesn't cut only in the direction of greater international harmony.
No, I didn't say harmony. I said interdependence, which is to say a correlation of fortunes among peoples around the world. So economic fortunes are more correlated, as we're now seeing, for better or worse. Interdependence is not necessarily a good thing, and it's only harmonious in a sometimes grim sense that you're equally badly off.
Right, and then so you just need to be careful of the fallacy of thinking that because we need something, therefore we're going to be able to get it. I mean,
but no, it's just the reason we should strive toward it, and I'm in favor of striving. And as I understand it, you're not.
I don't know why you keep saying that. I'm just pointing out to you the obstacles that stand in the way. Now, here's where if you say I'm opposed to moving in that direction, I'm opposed to moving down this course, which I consider to be strewn with obstacles, at the price of, in this case, not recognizing a people that had been brutalized. Who didn't want to continue to be brutalized and didn't want to live in Serbia, and therefore wanted to have some independence, and pretty much everybody in the liberal world agreed that that was true, not because of some abstract principle, because of what had actually happened to them. That's what happens in the world, things happen, and then people have to be dealt with on the basis of what's happened. I would not want to sacrifice their interests in the favor of some, in my view, very distant hope that this will somehow be a building block towards some international order, which I don't see in the offing. And so that's the question that you would have to ask.
But
how many sacrifices are you willing to make of other people in order to uphold this effort to head in this direction of more international legal doctrine?
But at the time we recognized the independence of Kosovo, they were in fact not being brutalized.
No, but they feared for they were in a state of suspended animation. They were not. The situation was not one that you could just say, well, let's leave it alone for 20 years. We were supposed to be moving in a certain direction. That was their understanding, and we had been moving in that direction as slowly as conceivably possible. But eventually, some kind of resolution of that problem was going to have to come.
Let me ask you this. Do you agree that after we unilaterally, or us and our friends unilaterally.
By the way, you've got a whole new definition of unilateral now. So how many countries is still unilateral?
I said us and our friends unilaterally. I
know, but it's not, the word unilateral doesn't even make any sense in that context.
There's us and our friends and Russia and their friends, okay? In this case, us and our friends decided to recognize... Here's my question. If after we recognize Kosovo's independence, suppose that Serbia had sent troops into Kosovo in an attempt to thwart the independence...
It's one of the things people are concerned about.
Right. Presumably, you would have favored us doing exactly what Russia, or roughly what Russia did after Georgia intervened following Russia's recognition of Ossetia's independence, right? I mean, you know...
Well, now we're into the details. I'm glad you're so confident you know exactly what happened in the case of Ossetia and Georgia and Russia. I mean,
we know Georgia did send troops in.
Yeah, but that was been in response to actions that were undertaken by rebel groups in Ossetia and Abkhazia, especially in Ossetia, that was supported by Russia. I mean, it wasn't...
Well, there is controversy over that, and the latest round of revisionism tends to work against Georgia.
By the way, Russia had a perfectly adequate answer to that problem, which is much more like what the European and American answer was. When that happened, and let's say they even sent in their troops, right? Mm-hmm. If they had said, okay, now we're immediately turning this over to an OSCE monitoring group, et cetera, and then we can begin to undertake negotiations to see whether Ossetia and Abkhazia should move toward independence or what we should do, but I'm now turning this over to a multilateral institution that can start dealing with this problem. You and I would not be having this discussion now. We might have said, gee, we wish that the Russians hadn't sent their troops in. We might have said we wish Saakashvili hadn't sent his troops in, but we would be... in what I think would be a fairly stable and diplomatically neutral, and we wouldn't be having this big crisis over Russia. But of course that's not what they did, because they have much more on their mind, and this is where you really do have to step, this is where you have to be careful of just looking at things as legal case studies. There's much more going on in Russia's mind in this case than merely the defense of minority groups on their borders that they feel some responsibility for. There's a much larger play involved in all this, as you know. And that is what is absent in the Kosovo situation. There's no great power in the Kosovo situation, attempting to exert its sphere of interest, exert its sphere of influence, and just determine...
I mean, there's two questions. Is that, in fact, on our agenda? And probably somewhere within the policy-making political mind of the U.S. collectively, you could find some traces of that. But another question is...
No, you couldn't. I can't let that pass. No, you couldn't.
Well, anyway, my main point is, can we... Is it a plausible perception of us, from Russia's point of view, that is the agenda? I mean, in the context of NATO expansion to Russia's borders, is it crazy to think that they will perceive it as actually part of a geostrategic threat? I don't think it's crazy to think they'd perceive it that way, and I don't doubt that to some extent they did perceive it that way.
Of course, it's crazy to perceive it that way. There's a lot of, let's separate various issues. If they want to be upset about the fact that we let the Baltic states into NATO, I can understand their strategic concerns about that, although I didn't notice anybody making a big hue and cry about why we shouldn't take the Baltics into NATO. But in the case of Kosovo independence, what is the strategic threat to Russia of Kosovo independence?
Well, if their idea is we want to own every piece of turf outside of Russia proper...
Wait a second, do you know where Kosovo is?
Yeah.
Is it on the border of Russia?
No.
So what do they care? What?
I mean, some various of the NATO nations aren't, but it's the collectivity of American power that bothers
What does Kosovo independence have to do about the collectivity of American power?
Well, let me ask you about something that does. What about missile defense? Do you think it's crazy?
We could have a discussion about missile defense.
What about the expansion of NATO generically? Do you think it was crazy and just not predictable that Russia would find that threatening?
I admire your ability to dance away from the question we were focusing on until...
Well, wait, you want to go back to questions we were supposed to answer? For starters, I would like your answer. If Serbia had intervened in Kosovo, would we have done what is at least in a rough sense analogous to what Russia did, which is intervene in Kosovo ourselves, just as Russia intervened?
I guess I should have labeled my answer to that question, answer to that question. The answer to that question was, if Russia had done what we would have done in that situation and what we did do, which is, yes, to blunt, let's say you want to go in and protect whatever enclaves are under siege, And then, if Russia had then turned it over to an international monitoring force, which it perfectly was capable of doing, the OSCE, and withdrew its forces and entered into a diplomatic process to decide how these enclaves and these places were going to be settled in terms of international, then we wouldn't have had an objection, and that's probably what we would have done. That's exactly the answer. And the problem is that that's not what Russia is concerned about. I mean, Russia, at the end of the day, is not concerned primarily about the fate of Ossetians. It is concerned primarily about its own position in that part of the world. And just to put a period on the one discussion we're having now, I'm happy to move to the other one. In the case of Kosovo, I defy anyone to explain to me what Russia's strategic interest was in the disposition of Kosovo. It was purely...
What was our strategic interest in the disposition of, of breakaway provinces within Georgia? I mean, are you saying that nations are only warranted in being concerned about their strategic interests?
Well, as long as you're now willing to say that this had nothing... If Kosovo had nothing to do with Russia's sense of security, which is where you were trying to wrap it all up...
I can imagine it did from their point of view.
Well, I can't, actually. I think that you've fallen for this effort by Putin to manufacture all these issues that they have with the United States, including, a dozen missile interceptors, which couldn't possibly affect Russia's nuclear force. Every issue that Putin has turned into what he insists is a major strategic East-West issue, you're buying his interpretation of his insistence on this. I don't. I don't think that everything that Russia claims is a problem to them is actually a problem to them.
Well, no, but you have a general pattern, I venture to say, and you won't agree with this, of kind of not being willing to entertain perceptions of American motivations other than the ones you hold. Right?
I disagree with that. I understand perfectly well the perceptions of American motivations, and I've written a lot, in fact, about other people's perceptions of American motivations.
But you have a very benign view of American motivations, and it seems to me you always... first of all, and some of them are themselves contestable, I'd say, but beyond that, you seem to always assume that Russia and China will hold those very same benign perspectives.
I don't assume that. In fact, I never even said anything to suggest that I assumed it. But the question as to whether let's say Russia even does perceive that it has a problem in Kosovo, should that be determinative in our judgment?
Well, look, my main point about Kosovo is, and maybe this is a question for you. Do you agree that our recognizing Kosovo, their independence, made it, A, easier for Russia to do what they did in recognizing Ossetia's independence, and B, more likely that they would do that? Do you agree with that?
It made it easier. I think they were going to do it anyway, and they certainly were going to... I think that they had this plan to deal with Georgia for quite some time. Putin has been angry and upset about Saakashvili going back at least 4 years. And he's considered Georgia a thorn in his side, and he's been beefing up their capabilities in the region. They've been certainly spurring the rebel movements in Ossetia to make more trouble. So yes, this was the proximate cause, but I don't think it was the deciding factor in Russian calculations by any means.
But it was a proximate cause. And do you agree that...
Sure, but you want to go into go through history and go through proximate causes of various things. They don't. Even being the proximate cause of something doesn't invalidate doing it.
No, not necessarily, but it changes... It's relevant to the question of whether we should have given something more thought. Anyway, you're just conceding one part of my argument, even though you don't think it's determinative.
I would say that I could go through all the actions that America's taken over the last 200 years and talk about how they were proximate causes for unfortunate events, because that's the way history is. But that doesn't really answer the question of whether you should do them or not.
Okay, and on... As far as Putin's designs on Georgia, do you agree that one thing that inspired him in that regard was our interest in making Georgia part of NATO?
The way I would put it is different than you would put it, and it's actually, I think, a fairly important distinction. It was Georgia's turn toward the West following its election, which produced in Georgia a desire to become part of NATO. This notion that the United States and its Western European allies go around the world in Europe looking for people to expand into NATO is, of course, exactly the opposite of what has occurred. What happens is that countries come knocking on the door. Poland comes knocking. It wasn't that anybody said, let's bring Poland into NATO. Poland comes knocking on the door, the Czech Republic comes knocking on the door, the Balts come knocking on the door, and then the question is, what do you say to them? Do you say yes or no? And that's the dilemma that we've faced ever since NATO.
So if Mexico came knocking on Russia's door and said, we want to be your ally, and Russia started shipping weapons to Mexico that were aimed at the United States, I mean, you would think, like, we had no reason to be concerned about that because Mexico knocked on their door?
What weapons have we shipped to Eastern Europe that are aimed
Well, part of membership in NATO would be a certain amount of military coordination, including...
defense. I mean, what's the?
Well, one man's defense is another man's offense. From Russia's point of view,
that's not technically true. That's not technically true, Bob. I mean, there were offensive capabilities and there were defensive capabilities.
You can never separate them entirely.
We haven't put missiles in Eastern Europe pointed at Russia. We haven't put large bodies of troops pointed at Russia. That's not what's going on.
Yeah, but even
Russia has no reason to fear an invasion from NATO. Do you think they do?
Even so-called missile defense is, from their point of view, plausibly part of an offensive threat because it could neutralize what they would do to counteract an attack. I mean, the line between these things.
Missile defense writ large, if it were to be deployed and successful, none of the following, and none of those having in fact been true, would affect Russia's strategic arsenal. But the interceptors in Poland will not affect Russia's strategic arsenal. You know what the best proof of that is, Bob? That Putin said, I don't object to the idea of interceptors, I just don't want them in Poland. Put them in Italy, put them in France, put them in Azerbaijan, which to me is definitive proof that he's not actually worried about the effect on the Russian arsenal. He's unhappy that they are going into a former Warsaw Pact country. That's what's really upsetting to Putin.
Well, I don't know enough about the technicalities to know if proximity to Russia increases, you're saying does not increase at all their effectiveness
against the Russian force? No.
I don't know that that's true, but I'll have to provisionally accept it.
Okay.
We should talk about something other than this.
Okay.
Now, G20 is kind of boring, you're right, but I'm interested in, I mean, it's relevant to what we were talking about. So just quickly, do you accept the in-principle case for international financial regulation?
Can I say honestly that I don't feel like I know nearly enough to even answer that question? I have no ideological predisposition against it, but I literally, my view would be almost entirely pragmatic, I hope, but I don't know what the pragmatic answer is. So if the pragmatic answer is yes, that would be the way to solve these problems, I would say yes, but I just don't know. Do you?
Well, I know there's an in-principle case because, the kind of contagion effect that warrants regulation at the national level. I mean, if you ask, why doesn't the government let a given bank lend as much money as they want without having any equity there to back it up, right? Yeah. Why does the government regulate the ratio, the equity reserves that a commercial bank has, since, after all of its customers are willingly entering into business? Why should I care if I'm not doing business with the bank? One of the answers is, ultimately, there can be a contagion effect when that bank collapses, and it can haunt me, and so there are, in other words, negative externalities. And the point is just that increasingly there are negative externalities internationally, as this crisis illustrated, because a lot of these problems started in America, and now they're everybody's problem. That's the in-principle case, I think.
Right. So then you'd obviously, extending the in-principle discussion, you'd have to, in principle, make sure that you were balancing regulation against this free flow of markets that we have also been celebrating as part of what globalization is, right? So, I mean, you wouldn't want to stifle, innovation and creativity, et cetera, right?
No, just as you don't at the national level.
Right.
And the kinds of things they talk about range from the relatively mild, like international accounting standards, to, I guess, conceivably actual equity requirements. I mean, for example, I imagine the Europeans are now a little unhappy to have learned that our investment banks were not required to hold any particular amount of equity relative to the amount of debt. And they had some of them had these astoundingly high rates of leverage, and that's part of the problem. And it turned out to spread across the Atlantic. Wouldn't surprise me if they said, why don't all the G20 nations and maybe the whole world agree on some kind of standards here?
Yeah. You're out of my depth, Bob.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Is that a compliment?
if you'd like to, I'm not sure. It depends on where you think my depth is.
Well, it's all relative.
It could be pretty
man.
deep.
It's all relative, you know. Status is a zero-sum game.
Or pretty shallow, I guess it would have.
Okay, so we don't have much time left. We shouldn't go over an hour probably. What do you want to talk about? China? I mean, you're always more worried about China than I am. So you
these days I don't know. I'm not so sure. China seems to me to be in a very patient mood, and they're probably looking a little bit inward. And the Taiwan situation seems calm for the moment, though I'm not as optimistic as some people are that it's sort of solved. And China is moving forward in terms of its military modernization program, which is eventually going to be a source of difficulty for us. But I'm not particularly exercised about China at this moment.
So can those of us who have been claiming for a long time that there wasn't much to worry about in China claim vindication, at least for this moment, before the...
I was never warning of an imminent conflict with China. I'm concerned about their rise as a great power because, like, just insofar as that the rise of any great power in a system poses challenges to the system. I mean, you'd certainly agree with that, right?
Well, in the sense that transition poses threats to systems, but I mean, assuming they behave in their rational self-interest, I don't see tremendous cause for concern, and so far they seem to be pretty rational.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I guess, the thing that I would caution against, and I would caution against this in Russia and pretty much in the world at large, is let's not count on countries being economic maximizers. And I think we fall into the trap a little bit of thinking that, if they have an economic problem, then they're going to conduct their foreign policy such as to solve or address that economic problem. And countries like people don't live on bread alone, and there are other issues at stake. In the case of Russia, I think there's a lot about ambition, resentment that's affecting Russian foreign policy, which is not necessarily maximizing their economic well-being. Now, China has been more focused on the economy because its leadership is much more attuned to the need to keep the people happy. But there are other options for China, too. And I guess the question I would have for you is, we've been operating in a pretty benevolent economic environment for the last, 20 years or so. And now we are moving into a less benevolent economic environment. Would you say that all the principles of convergence that I would associate with you hold true even in times of economic difficulty like we're heading into now?
I wasn't aware that convergence was my ideology.
Oh, what's the matter, Bob? You don't like to have all your views caricatured at you?
Better than not mentioned at all. So I encourage you to keep talking. Well, no, I agree. It's cause for concern. I'm guessing more in Russia than in China, aren't you? I mean, aren't you more worried about the dangers of economic calamity, the implications of economic calamity in Russia than in China?
I'm more worried about it because it seems more obvious now. But I mean, look, if you and I woke up a week from now and read in the newspapers that the Chinese economy was entering into a state of collapse, I'm sure we'll have a very different discussion about what there is to worry about and not worry about. I mean, right now they're not, so we don't have to worry.
I mean, I will say this is an interesting segue to something maybe I should bring up with you anyway about China, which is that my view. I mean, people like you are known to point out that China, is not exactly a democracy, and that moving toward capitalism has not turned it into a democracy. My reply is that that's true, but China has become kind of de facto pluralistic in a lot of ways, and I would point to technologies that are abetting this, like cell phones and email and everything, are making it easier for citizens when they have a grievance to express it, often through rioting and things, and the Chinese government is responsive to this kind of thing, and that's the sense in which the popular will is not infrequently respected in China these days. But in that context, and you might want to comment on that itself, but in that context, I guess it's a little worrying that there's already a lot of civil unrest in China of exactly that kind, and I guess if things get a whole lot worse economically, it could get a lot worse. I don't know.
Are you taking the Fareed Zakaria position? We need more authoritarianism, not less, in China?
No, I'm not really taking that view, and I didn't know that was quite his view. But I'm just saying, No, I'm not. I mean, when I read about these riots, I'm on the side of the people. I mean, and what I would hope is that China, the government, would develop a more orderly means of expressing grievances.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, unfortunately, I think what you'll get. I mean, you're going to get a little of each in China, I would guess. One is, responsiveness of the kind that you're talking about, and the other is a more effective way of finding out who the heck is leading these things and dealing with them. I mean, you've got both, right?
Yeah. I suppose that's true. Whereas with Russia, it's just easier to imagine a very ugly nationalism emerging in the short run.
Well, it's already, I would say the nationalism is already fairly ugly.
Some people would, yes. But since I want to stay on good terms with all the nations of the world...
Right, because someone has got to keep this flame alive.
That's
right.
And
I think you are just the guy to do it.
Thank you. Well... Should we leave it about there? I mean, we could, you had mentioned Iran, but we could come back some other time and talk about that kind of stuff. That's probably not a subject to deal with in 3 minutes.
No, I don't think so. I think that we've dealt with the large issues of what is possible in humanity. Mm-hmm. We've dealt with the minutia of what should be done with a few 100,000 Kosovars, and that's a lot.
Well, you've inspired me to start reading the newspapers, because I really think I would have done a lot better here if I knew what was going on in the world.
I don't think that's the issue, Bob. You seem to be
You just think I'm wrong.
No, I don't want to say right and wrong. I think that what we grappled with in this conversation are the issues that need to be grappled with, and I'm not, you think that I just... Your view of my view is that I don't want a better world, that I think that it's better to have a bad world,
No, I think our views of each other are that we acknowledge that we each want a better world, and we think that the other one is just profoundly confused.
Well, I think it's more a question of that. The way I would put it is that that wanting a better world. The good. I would say that it's a classic case of the best being the enemy of the good, and that my view of how to get to a better world does rely more on the power of nations rather than on international legal principles, just because I think it's going to be very hard to set them up. And you want to be more optimistic about doing that, and you don't want the behavior of nations to trample on that. And I understand that position, and it's a real tension. It's not just, you're right and I'm wrong, or the other way around. It's a real tension that I think if we forever, this is never going to happen, fortunately, if we found ourselves in positions of policymaking, we'd have to come up with some kind of compromise that kept both, that took acknowledgement of both.
Yeah, but it's not just an abstract preference for international law in my case. I also think that if things go well in the world, okay, which is to say if our ideology of free markets and so on spreads, then there will be an inevitable decline in relative American power. And the way to prepare for such a world is to create a world order in which you don't have to be the most powerful nation to do well.
No.
And that's why I want to establish an international structure of law and respect
for it. This is the John Eikenberry position, and I respect it. And the only place I disagree is I'm not sure we're going to be able even to get from here to there now. You know what I mean? That the international system, that the great power competition that we're now involved in is going to make it very hard to do even that. It's not even is that a wise thing to do, because in principle it is a wise thing to do. But I'm not at all optimistic you can even do that.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll leave it there. You could also at some point have an argument with John about this stuff.
I'm always talking to John. I'd love to have it done.
Yeah. He lives down the street.
Oh, okay.
So, well, thanks.
All right. Well, thank you.
We should do this again at some point, because you got to settle this Iran thing before they weaponize.
Well, you got about 5 minutes, I think. So
that was in the newspaper today.
Let's get rolling.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll do it soon then.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Bob.
Bye, Bob.